Late August 1924. Bates. Thomas called to his lordship's valet as the flurry of activity had begun. Dinner had finished and brandy and cigars were being called for in the library. The ladies had gone to bed. John Bates stopped in the process of carrying his lordship's shoes into the boot room and looked inquiringly at Thomas. Part 2 of the plan. Part 1 had been a letter taken up by Carson to Tom Branson that had arrived from the post office, to meet him at the chauffeur's cottage. Not that any chauffeur lived there now. Taylor lived in the village as did Brown. Both drove for Lord Grantham and neither lived on the premises. Carson had complained that the delivery had come through so late. But a summons, for that was what Prue's letter amounted to, did not make it any easier to ask. He swallowed down his gut instinct, which was to allow the letter, written by Jack Prue, to take its course, follow Tom Branson out to the cottage, and lay into him. Thomas. Bates looked up, but Thomas said nothing else, but stepped past him and into the boot room, holding the door as an invitation for Bates to follow. "You said you would help me, when the time came," Thomas told him, as Bates closed the door. "For Milo, for justice." "And so I will," Bates told him. "What do you have in mind?" "What is being taken care of by Jack Prue," Thomas told him. "Milo is here, at her house in the village, and will come with Prue up here. It seems like ... Irish business, based on the law on which ... he did that to her." "And you're going along with it?" Thomas sighed. "Yes," he said, "eventually. Prue thinks it will hurt him more than I would hurt him, long term." "Have you ever heard of something called a glamdison?" "Certainly I have," Bates told him. "My mother told me about it. It's some sort of accusation. The accused suffers disgrace ... shame, blame, being despised, dismissed, banished from society. It will condemn his behavior." Thomas shifted from foot to foot. "He has to admit what he has done is wrong," Thomas told Bates. "Of course, I believe Milo. This relies on his confession. Prue said it must be witnessed by me, because I am her husband, and some sort of recompense will come to me." He laughed for a moment. "And witnessed by another Irish person." "I know that it is not done lightly," John Bates admitted. "And then Milo has to give a gaze, some sort of rule he must follow," Thomas told him. "I have heard of these, too. A curse befalls someone who breaks the gaze." Bates lowered his head. "But Thomas, why are you doing this? Why not go to the police? Did you overgreen?" He replied, wryly. "And what would you have done if you had found yourself alone with the man?" "I know my situation is somewhat different, but..." "Killed him," Bates told him. "I would have killed the bastard for doing that to my wife." "While my love for Milo is not the same," Thomas told him, "I would appreciate an ally who would stay my hand, for everyone's sake, particularly Sibby's." "For the memory of Lady Sybil." Bates nodded, and leaned over, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. "Of course," he told him, "of course I will come with you, if only to stop you beating the living daylights out of the man yourself. If this is justice, I would be happy to witness it." "Irish justice," Thomas told him. "Prue assures me that it is far more effective." 88,888,888. It was a strange message that Tom Branson received, slipped to him after the remove to the drawing room. It was, as he expected, written in Irish. It would come to him, eventually. He would be caught up with, not by the Royal Irish Constabulary. Tom wondered whether they even existed anymore after the Civil War, but by the rebels. He had betrayed them. Ultimately, he had run to Downton with Sybil in tow. While Irish folk tended to forgive, they never forgot. Making as if to go to bed, Tom Branson nipped down the back stairs, pressing himself into the shadows as two maids giggled past him, sheets in hand, and he waited until they had got to the third floor, where one held the door for the other. Still giggling, Branson trod his way over the yard, and out into the grounds, turning left and out into the courtyard, where the garages were. Behind it, his old home for a time. Many an hour he had sat in there, ruminating his resentment at the British establishment, at the many-headed Hydra who had caused devastation to his family, had murdered his cousin, probably a rebel, had been the official reply to his aunt as to why Finn had been shot. It didn't matter that he had been a rebel, and had been on his way with a friend to the Liffey to unload stolen explosives for storage by Well, men who answered to Jack Prue. Tom sighed. Revolutions happened because those needing justice stood up to the law. It wasn't right if men representing the law went maverick and dispensed off the books justice, so to speak. It was a pity he had been wrong about the Russian one, but that was one thing he liked Sarah Bunting for, her support of socialist uprising as a means to ignite the distribution of wealth. The war had helped, too. People in Britain had sent off sons, husbands, brothers, and those who had come back, having survived, bodily, had little long-term prospects. The working class demanded justice and people were speaking up to allow that to happen. All cuts and stabs and thrusts to the British establishment which, inconveniently, ironically, Tom Branson had married into, and which protected him. And ultimately, he had failed to be a sleeper agent, and betray Lord Grantham and his family. No light was on in the cottage that Tom could see as he crossed the lawn, and around to the left, along the garages. Perhaps he had got it wrong. Perhaps it was a different time, or a different place. Tom Branson reached for the letter again. Number. He was not wrong. But then, Prue might not risk coming over until he was sure they would be alone. What did he want with him? To go back, pick up here where he left off. Number. He would not. Ireland was his homeland, even if he was wanted for questioning after his involvement in burning down Daphne Castle, Prue's workplace he used as a cover for his rebel activities. And he would not betray the Crawleys. Tom Branson reached the door, and pushed down on the handle. It gave, and the door swung on its hinges. He stepped into the living room that he remembered. "Hello? Anyone there?" he called, and repeated this in the Irish. Tom looked around. Why had he come? Forgiveness? As he looked around at the settee, and the shelves and the door that led to the kitchen, he knew, Tom Branson wanted a way back in, and he hoped Jack Prue was there to give it to him. And the lights flickered on. In the sudden brightness, Tom Branson blinked, and when his eyes had adjusted, he saw the diminutive figure of Jack Prue standing by the kitchen door. "Good evening, Mr. Branson," Prue said, in English, clearly for the benefit of non-Irish speakers. Tom glanced about him, looking for a way out, but John Bates was impeding his access to the back door, Thomas Barrow blocking the route he had just come in by from the front. "Why am I here?" Branson asked, loudly, trying to contain his fear. It wasn't Irish business, then, but something else. And if Thomas Barrow was involved? "You know," Jack Prue told him. "You know full well." "I really don't," but Thomas Barrow was storming towards him, right hand balled up into a fist. "Can I hit him now?" he growled, his frame bearing down on Branson, aggression in his features. Bates grabbed him, and held his shoulders, more for Thomas's sake than his own, Tom reasoned, and a screw of shame entered his heart. He had betrayed Sybil with his treatment of me Lucina Ashby. He should have been grateful for what he had, rather than see his claim to the ancient baronetcy as his way back into his own country. Prue turned his head to Thomas, more of a theatre than anything. Now, Mr. Barrow," Jack Prue cautioned. "That is the English way to sort things out, husband shamed, wife dissuaded." His voice was light, as if he really were cautioning Thomas, but his words were also clipped, short, words intending to educate. "And you have your position to think about." "But I like the English way," he added, and drew back his own arm, swinging a fist into Tom Branson's face. In the shadows, Milo gasped, clamping a hand over her mouth. She must not come out until Prue asked her, however. What was that for? Tom Branson cried, holding his face. "For cowardice, Mr. Branson," Prue told him, amused at the outrage on Tom Branson's face. "A coward who has run away from his homeland, who gave a white feather to a brave man serving his country." Prue looked to Thomas Barrow and gave him a nod. Thomas gave a brief nod back. "Don't give him anything that he can use against you, Thomas," Jack Prue had cautioned. "Let me do it. He cannot get to me as he can to you." But it did not stop the name of his former lover falling from his lips. Ernest. His voice was softer, poignant. And then he turned his aggression back to Branson. "He died for his country. You ran from yours. Who is the coward, really?" And then Thomas fell silent, looking away from Tom, Jack, Bates, anyone, his mind filled with his memories of his most beloved. And, as for what you did to his sister, Jack Prue continued, that is what we are here for. Justice. Irish justice. Sister, Tom Branson mused, still holding his face. Your wife? My wife, Thomas confirmed, looking Tom Branson in the eye. You raped her. And he had said it. Prue had mentioned that Thomas needed to be the one to say it. But, given the circumstances, he would have said it anyway, although now, here, it was in a far more restrained manner than Thomas had imagined he would be saying it. In fact, he had imagined himself accusing Tom Branson of raping Milo many times, and in all imaginings it was he who was hitting the man. They were alone, in his imagining, and, unlike Prue's single punch, Thomas doubted he would stopped. Tom Branson looked at Thomas Barrow, in horror. Sir, he added, acidly. I was. Branson looked away. Drinking? I don't think so. I think, the face you put on for Lady Sybil's family is a show, a mask, one that hides your true nature. Like you mean? Tom Branson shot back. Me? Thomas scoffed. But a restraining hand came to Thomas's shoulder, just as he needed it. John Bates's gesture had diffused his rising anger, which had been coalescing into rage. Instead, Jack Prue turned and called into the darkness. Me Lucina, you can come out. And that was the last he said in English until he left the cottage in an indeterminate time in the future, and he glanced to John Bates, who was startled for a moment when Prue called something else in the Irish language, remembering that Prue had told him that the Glamdison and Gace, the accusation and sentence, would be in his native tongue. Can you speak Irish? Thomas had asked Bates as they crossed the lawn. I cannot, John Bates had replied. But I do have some ideas of the Ban laws. They mostly concern land and property. In this sense, to be crude, Miss Ashby is classed as property. He had sighed as the cottage grew big in Thomas's view. If he confesses to rape, then he has defiled your property. A perverted view of property, Thomas considered, even for a woman who was a conventional type of wife, with a conventional type of husband. Me Lucina had, when she had put on Ernest's clothes and shorn her hair close, not even seemed like a woman in that sense. Thomas had seen her as a person, as someone with opinions and ideas, not someone who, because of their sex, had to conform to what society said a woman was meant to be. And for the first time, he realized, he no longer felt that same obligation he had when he had married her, for protection, for pity. Thomas Barrow found he was proud that she was his wife, for all she had achieved. With that thought in mind, he glowered at Tom Branson again as the next words that were spoken were in the Irish tongue. Afterwards, when he asked Milo, the night before she had returned to Cambridge, and asked her what had gone on, she told him that, as Druid, Prue had invested Milo in the authority to speak the Glamdison. Branson had admitted his crime, and as such, admitted his claim to the Inchiquin title. Then, Thomas could only rely on the expressions of those involved, of Milo, of Prue, and of Branson, like a strange pantomime where the storyline could only be guessed at, Milo speaking in a kind of chant, and Branson replying, darting looks to Prue, and sometimes to Thomas. At length, an agreement was made, and there was a pause. Thomas then thought he heard the word, Gace. He leaned a little forward, so as not to miss the sentence. Branson could deny the sentence, Prue had explained, but that would bring dishonor and banishment. And if he did, Milo would begin the Troscad. At her words, Tom Branson turned sharply to Thomas, his face full of horror. It took a moment for him to speak words, as if he were finding switching languages tricky. Eventually he began with, Barrow. Yes? If you have any influence over your wife, I beg you. He broke off, when he saw Thomas's expression. Next to Milo, Prue gave him a grin, one Thomas recognized of old. Stay quiet, and all will be well. Sir? I am the kin of Lord Inchiquin of Clare, O'Brien, he stuttered. To get the He stummed, fortune of this young woman I forced myself upon her, me Lucina Ashby. The hand again, This time Bates had grabbed his forearm. Prue's expression urged Thomas to wait, and he listened as Branson turned back to Milo and Jack. Prue. She did not scream, Prue. He declared. If the assignation was unlawful. He broke off, and turned to Milo. Bates's grip tightened. And as a titled Irishman, you know that the Brehon laws do not hold in lieu of titlehood, Prue reminded him. In taking her body, you accepted your title, and in accepting your title, you broke all laws of protection of those inferior in status, you hanged yourself, so to speak. And Thomas Barrow could not help being amused at the ironic position Branson was now in. He watched him look to Milo. It was a terrible thing to do. Will you forgive me? Branson asked of her. You accept the case? Milo asked, calmly, measuredly. Branson gave her a shocked look. I will not. What you are asking is outrageous, he declared in English. What is she asking? Asked Thomas. To renounce my country, and to leave Downton. That is my case, Milo told him. I have spoken it. It has been declared. I am not doing it. He told her, angrily. I have my life here. I have Sibby. There was a pause. Everyone looked to Tom Branson. But you admit you raped her? Thomas sought to clarify. I did. And this time, Bates's grip was not enough to stop Thomas. Punch after punch landing in stomach and chest, with one final blow to the face. Bates eventually pulled Thomas off as Milo just watched, saying nothing, doing nothing. You need to know she lost a child, your child, in the fall, Prue told him in Irish, bending over Tom Branson. As the man felt his wounds, blood was pouring from his nose. He stopped, and stared at Milo, greatly shocked. And what did he say next? Thomas asked Milo. Later, Milo took his hand and held it, inhaling deeply. That he would have pronounced the same thing, she told him. But that he still would not comply with the case. 888,888 Milo, why are you sitting out here? I thought you were at Cambridge. It was the morning and the sun was coming up. It had not been a cold night, but Bates had brought Milo out a blanket. Lady Mary. Milo smiled. The easterly sun had woken her up and she moved under its glare, but she did not get to her feet from her spot at the entrance of Downton Abbey. It had been with little ceremony that she had settled onto the doorstep the night before, the men leaving her, walking their separate ways. Tom Branson kept looking behind him, Milo noticed, as if in disbelief at what had gone on. She had barely believed it either, at how well it had gone. Prue had coached her on the phrasings the evening before and she had managed it perfectly. Just as an Glamdison or a Gace could fail on a word, so could her testimony. It was no wonder the ancients thought that writing and speaking by a bard was a kind of magic. Did you stay out here all night? Lady Mary asked. Were you trying to get in? Milo smiled and got to her feet. No, Lady Mary. And after Bates had gone, Thomas had reappeared and stayed with her until the glimmerings of the sun had appeared on the horizon. He had asked whether she was sure she was prepared to do this, to fast against Tom Branson at his rejection of the judgment. Milo had said yes, and he had asked no more. Do you wish to change? Do you wish to wash? Have something to eat? No, she told Lady Mary. Prue had advised her to answer all questions, while under the Troscad truthfully. If the questions unearthed the truth of the wrong, then so be it. It was Milo's kind of word games, patterns, meanings, double meanings. That last was the Irish way of thinking. Prue had told her, and had told her again of some of the legends, of Neil no Agualarc and, neither here, nor there. The ancient Irish liked the liminal things, as well as the number 9. Or 3 threes, or 33. Milo sighed. The night before had seemed like another learning opportunity with Prue, as it had been when she had been in sea. Now, she felt as if she had lived her heritage, and not in a terrible way. So what are you doing out here? Fasting, Milo told her. Fasting? Mary repeated. She gave Milo a look. Milo got to her feet. Fasting? What for? But before Milo could answer, a figure approached them. Milo saw that it was Tom Branson. He was walking with his head bowed to one side, as if defeated. And when he spoke, it was clear he had been. I agree, he told Milo in Irish, though his features looked for all the world as if he were greeting her as a much-wanted friend. I acquiesced to the gay's call off the Troscad. Milo inhaled, her heart beating quickly, as if the adrenaline she had produced for a fight was building for nothing. She raised a hand to her head. Prue had told her what to say at this point. She glanced at Mary, though of course the woman knew no Irish. "Tarseeth ut," she told him loudly, not mimicking his deliberate faux show of welcome, clearly designed to fool his sister-in-law. "It is done." "Mary," Tom told her, putting a hand to her shoulder and guiding her away from Milo, "after the memorial, may I have words with you about my emigration to America? I have a cousin in Boston, and well," he flickered a glance to Milo, "let us talk about it over breakfast." "Just as soon as I can help Miss Ashby," Lady Mary told him, and gave Milo what Mary Crawley probably thought was a sympathetic look, but was rather full of piteous contempt. "She has slept out here all night," she added, giving her a pitiful look. "Milo, would you like to come in and be ready for the service? We start at 11. "I do not believe you will have time to change." "I can show you," Tom Branson offered, but Milo shook the palm of her hand towards him. "Thank you for your concern, Lady Mary," Milo told her. "The Troscad is over, the debt is to be paid. I will go round to the kitchens, now." And she ignored Mary Crawley's look of confusion, as she laughed at Milo's semi-comprehensible words. And Milo turned her back on Tom Branson, literally as well as figuratively. 88,888,888. Milo made her own way to the back door, which was opened by Anna, who was carrying a basket of washing. She held the handle open as Anna stepped out, and then slipped in beside her. Mrs. Patmore called someone further ahead, and the Downton cook turned before she saw Milo, and headed into the hall. There were rolls in a basket ready to go upstairs for breakfast. Was she ready to eat already? She took one, and folded it into a napkin, pushing it into her pocket. "Hello," a voice called to her, and Andy the footman nodded to her, as he picked up the tray with the rolls and turned, heading out of the kitchen. It was strange, sitting in the kitchen, strange and also comforting. The seat she was in had been Milo's for as long as she could remember. And perhaps because she was so used to being the that people were so used to her being the too, for it took Mrs. Hughes 3 bustles in and out, as well as Mrs. Patmore organizing the luncheon for after the memorial service, calling for Daisy to put in the lamb. It was only when Mrs. Hughes crossed to the pantry that she saw Milo, and put her hand to her mouth. "Milo." "Yes, Mrs. Hughes," she told her. "Oh, Milo!" she exclaimed. "Milo, Lady Mary told me you were here." "And I am here," Milo nodded. "And in your work clothes?" Mrs. Hughes nodded to her, fussing. "It is a good thing that I have some of your old clothes in the under-housekeeper's room, your room," she added, putting an arm out, which Milo interpreted as being an invitation to get up and follow her. "When did you arrive?" "Lady Mary said you were sitting at the front of the house. After the state Mr. Branson came home in last night, I was getting worried about you." The room was as Milo remembered it, a bed made up, wardrobe to one side, and an otherwise Spartan interior. Mrs. Hughes opened the door and shook out a long black skirt and underskirt, and a long-sleeved, high-necked blouse. "I have been getting the maids to put in mothballs," she said. "I didn't send them, as you can see. I am sorry for forgetting," and she reached into her pocket, pulling out the £5 note. "Yours," she told Milo, fussing at her again so that she did not protest. "I assume you weren't going like that to the service?" "No," Milo admitted. She wanted something that Ernest might have remembered her in, something he had seen her in, so that when his name was read out, they might be together, in spirit, at Downton once again. "Thank you, Mrs. Hughes." Milo looked at the overskirt. It did look as if moths might have had a nibble, but she knew she might be able to disguise it, with some coal blacking on the underskirt. Mr. Melsley had shown her that trick. "Daisy," Mrs. Hughes called out of the room, and down the corridor. Mr. Carson turned, seeing Mrs. Hughes in the doorway as she called once more. When there was no answer, Miss Baxter crossed past Carson, and nodded to the butler. "Daisy is helping Mrs. Patmore with the lamb," she told Mrs. Hughes, But Miss Baxter broke off, and when she saw Milo, Miss Ashby, yes? Milo nodded. But Miss Baxter said nothing more, as Mrs. Hughes passed her Milo's clothes. Miss Baxter, could you give them a freshen up and an iron? Miss Ashby is a guest of his lordship, and is here for the memorial service, she added, for Carson's benefit as well. It will be better and gentlemen's trousers, at any rate, she added, smiling at Milo. It is terrific to see you, Milo, she added, turning back to her. But what in heaven's name made you sleep outside the front door? Any one of us would have let you in. Milo simply nodded, for she had not expected to be inside Downton Abbey that day. In her mind, either Branson would have accepted her gaze, or been stubborn about it, and she would have been sitting outside for days. She simply hadn't expected that, when she had begun the Drosscads, that he would have given in so soon. Will they be suitable to honor my brother? Milo asked, suddenly feeling a little trembly. She wanted so much to be at the service, and never did think the people here, at Downton, would be a different make-up to those she had left. Andy, the footman she had met in London, seemed to be a permanent fixture, and there were new faces amongst the maids and the groundskeepers. How different it had been to when Aaron had been alive. Matthew Crawley, for one. Yes, Elsie Hughes nodded. Yes, indeed, Milo, she told her. Milo felt to her pocket. She was finally feeling in enough of a position that she might eat the role. And, could you thank Mr. Bates? She asked. Thank me for what? Bates, who had happened to be passing, in search of Anna, paused at the under-housekeeper's door. The blanket, Milo told him. You must have noticed me at the front of the house, fasting. Mrs. Hughes gave John Bates a quick glance. You must have been very tired. You were sleeping, Bates told her, glancing to Mrs. Hughes. You looked peaceful, and the weather has been good, so I left you. There has been an attack, as you know, Mrs. Hughes told him. Bates lowered his head, his eyes twinking towards Milo. Mr. Branson came back all the worse for it. If I had known, I would have woken you. Thank you, Mr. Bates, Milo told him, giving him a deliberate look. My thanks. Don't mention it, he told her. I can see you are safe now, and you have a roll to eat. We wouldn't want to see you starve. He paused, just for a heartbeat. I am sure Mrs. Batemore has more food if you want it. Thank you, Mr. Bates, Mrs. Hughes said, and he walked off, with a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. So it was over, then. Milo would not forget the feeling of Branson pushing himself inside her, telling her to hold still, stupid girl. Which, to part of Milo's mind, felt just as insulting. Thank you, Mrs. Hughes, Milo told her. I will have some breakfast, if you wouldn't mind. Thank me? She told Milo. Why? For being here. Now I have come back, for she told the woman. For always being here. I like things when they are the same. Come here, Mrs. Hughes told her, and opened her arms. You have been through enough in your short life. No one deserves things they like as much as you deserve them. It was while Milo was halfway through her second roll, with a cup of tea, that Daisy, delighted to see her and talking 19 to the dozen, had made for her, that Mrs. Baxter came back in with the dress. I took the liberty of replacing the lace, she told Milo, as well as mend the holes. She hung the hanger on a hook near the fireplace. I hope you like it. It was addressed to Milo, something to cover herself with. But she nodded, as was expected. If Mrs. Hughes thought it was good enough to think of her in, Milo did too. I do like it, Milo nodded, idly pulling out the apple pips from the apple Daisy had given to her, and putting them on the table in front of her. Would Dr. Seward be interested in these, too? Daisy had told her they were from new trees, hybrids, Mr. Blackford tells us, Mrs. Hughes told her, when Milo had asked. And then the conversation stilted, and Miss Baxter excused herself to do her next task, and Daisy continued to talk idly, and Mrs. Patmore, having had a muffled conversation with Mrs. Hughes, left with the housekeeper, their low voices filling the hallway. I will be there, to think of William, Daisy told Milo, as she gave her another cup of tea. Did you love him very much? Milo asked, taking a sip. It was a little cold, and there was too much milk in it, but it was quenching her thirst, so she said nothing about it. In my own way, Daisy told her, he was kind and fair and honest, and, well, we sort of got one another. She stepped closer to Milo. To be honest, I was quite swept up in the whole thing, and my heart was sore when he was captured. I married him to make him happy, if I am honest, she told Milo. But, I expect love would have come through properly after, if he'd have lived, she added. Milo nodded. She didn't really understand what Daisy was telling her, but she felt like that about Thomas in some ways. Milo cared for him, and liked the part of him he shared with her, his true self, that he never held back, sensitive, caring, observant of the smallest of detail, good with his hands, particularly mechanical devices. And he never denied his attraction to men. He seemed comfortable in her presence, and she in his. "And you will be remembering your brother, Ernest," came Thomas's voice, and Milo looked from Daisy into the eyes of her husband. Thomas walked slowly towards her, a soft look on his face. "You're here, eating breakfast," he said, patently stating the obvious. "Would you like a cup of tea too, Thomas?" Daisy asked. Thomas turned his head and smiled at Downton's undercook. "On a day like today, I would love one," he told her, then pulled across a chair and sat beside Milo, ignoring Daisy's look of confusion. "It's true," Thomas told Milo, near her ear. "He is going after their visit to the Cinderbees." Thomas saw the tickets himself. Lord Grantham had them. Boston, 2 fares, one way, one adult, one child. Milo could not help but gasp, and put a hand to her mouth. "Then I was right to release him from the Droskad," Milo told him, softly. "If you believe you are right, Milo," Thomas told her, kissing her briefly on the temple, "and you always are, then you can put it behind you, and get on with your life." Starting with a visit to Germany,